Cannabis Common Sense, the show that tells the truth about marijuana and the politics behind its prohibition.
Welcome to another exciting edition of Cannabis Common Sense. We have another great show for you tonight. Ellen Comp is our guest. She is an author and an activist. She helped Jack Herer co-write or edit the 9th edition of his book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes. So it'll be a great interview. You got to stay tuned for that. But first we have our hemp news. And even before that, we have our infamous dancing cannabis leaves.
I feel the force.
Okay, our first story in our hemp news segment tonight is from the nation's capital. On Monday, February 2nd, Senators Cory Booker, Oregon's own Ron Wyden, and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer released a joint statement declaring their intention to release a draft discussion bill outlining how to best legalize and regulate cannabis and cannabis commerce in a post-prohibition America. These three leading champions of marijuana reform in Congress said on Monday that the issue will be prioritized in the new Democratic Senate this year, that they plan to release draft legislation in the coming weeks to begin a conversation about what federal policy change will look like. The U.S. Senate leaders said in a joint statement that ending cannabis prohibition, quote, is necessary to right the wrongs of the failed war and end decades of harm inflicted on communities of color across the country. But that alone is not enough, end quote. The lawmakers, each of whom has advocated for federal legalization, said, quote, we must also enact measures that will lift up people who were unfairly targeted in the war on drugs, end quote, especially as more states opt to legalize. Their statement reads, quote, we're committed to working together to put forward and advance comprehensive cannabis reform legislation that will not only turn the page on this sad chapter in American history, but also undo the devastating consequences of the discriminatory policies. The Senate will make consideration of these reforms a priority, end quote. This marks the first time we've seen a coalition of Senate leaders publicly announce their intent to introduce and move legislation in the upper chamber that seeks to end federal cannabis prohibition. This is a uniquely powerful Senate coalition, and here's why. Senator Booker is from New Jersey and sits on the powerful Senate Judiciary Committee and is the leading voice for the advancement of criminal justice reform issues. Senator Wyden, from here in Oregon, will head the powerful Senate Finance Committee, one of the primary committees of jurisdiction over this effort. And Senator Schumer is the leader of the United States Senate, and as such, he sets the legislative priorities and agenda for the upper chamber. But the way the Senate rules work, every single senator has a great amount of influence in the chamber. That's why we need you to make a difference and to contact your Senate leader. Of course, here in Oregon, our Senator Wyden and Merkley are both strong supporters of marijuana law reform. But if you're anywhere else in the country, please contact your United States senators and tell them to support Leader Schumer and Booker and Wyden in reforming marijuana laws. They need to hear from you early and often, so call them up. Across the United States, 2 U.S. governors reiterated their calls for marijuana legalization in their state this week. New Mexico's Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham during her State of the State address, and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz during a budget briefing. New Mexico, the first slate of what's expected to be several bills to legalize marijuana in New Mexico this year, were introduced on Monday. A Republican New Mexico senator is sponsoring one of the newly filed bills, while the other is being sponsored by a Democrat. But because neither piece of legislation comprehensively addresses social equity issues, advocates are holding out hope for a separate New Mexico House bill that's expected to be formally introduced this week. New Jersey's legislature is moving to implement full adult legalization as lawmakers reached a compromise with Governor Murphy early this week on cleanup legislation to address underage marijuana possession penalties, avoiding a potential conditional veto on a separate legalization implementation measure that's already on the New Jersey governor's desk. A little farther north in New Hampshire, Two adult use legalization bills were defeated after committee members voted to retain the bills, essentially killing them for this year. In North Dakota, senators voted 42-4 to defeat legislation to allow patients to grow medical cannabis for therapeutic purposes. The next story is out of Israel. Elderly subjects with hypertension respond favorably to medical cannabis treatment, according to observational data published in the European Journal of Internal Medicine. A team of investigators affiliated with Israel's Ben Gurion University assessed the impact of medical cannabis administration on hypertension in 26 elderly patients with a mean age of 70, or an average age of 70, over a 3-month period. Study subjects ingested cannabis either orally, via oil extracts, or by smoking. Researchers performed the following assessments on the participants: 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, ECG, or electrocardiogram, blood tests, and anthropometric measurements prior to the initiation of cannabis therapy and 3 months afterwards. The primary outcome was a change in the mean 24-hour blood pressure at 3 months. The authors reported, quote, cannabis treatment for 3 months was associated with a reduction in systolic and diastolic blood pressure, as well as heart rate, end quote. Several of the subjects in the study reported symptoms of dizziness following cannabis administration. Patients' use of cannabis was not associated with an elevated risk of arrhythmias during the study period. Cannabinoids have been previously shown to influence blood pressure and other cardiovascular responses, though many of these effects are short-term in duration, and most subjects become tolerant to them after a short period. According to a review of the data published in the Journal of Neuropharmacology, quote, the endocannabinoid system plays an important cardiovascular regulatory role not only in pathophysiological conditions associated with excessive hypotension, but also in hypertension. Thus, the pharmacological manipulation of this system may offer novel therapeutic approaches in a variety of cardiovascular disorders, end quote. This study, Cannabis is associated with blood pressure reduction in older adults, a 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure monitoring study, appears in this month's edition of the European Journal of Internal Medicine. Our last story tonight is out of Toronto, Canada. Patients authorized to use medical cannabis for pain significantly reduce or eliminate their use of opioids over time. According to a study in the Canadian Journal of Anesthesia, a team of Canadian investigators assessed patterns of self-reported opioid consumption in a cohort of authorized medical cannabis patients who suffered from pain-related issues. Consistent with numerous other studies, the researchers reported that many subjects tapered their use of opioids following medical cannabis initiation. The study said, quote, the proportion of individuals who reported using opioids decreased by half over a period of 12 months, they determined. In addition, subjects, quote, pain intensity and pain-related intensity interference scores were reduced and their quality of life and general health symptom scores were improved compared with baseline, end quote. The authors also noted that many subjects switched from consuming herbal cannabis to ingesting oil extracts over the course of the trial. The authors concluded, quote, over time, individuals who continued consuming cannabis within this longitudinal study reported lower pain severity and pain interference scores, as well as improved quality of life and general health symptom scores. Beneficial effects of cannabis appear to persist long-term, and tolerance may not become a significant issue for patients on a stable regimen. The proportion of patients using opioids at each follow-up was decreased, suggesting an opioid-sparing effect with cannabis use. Our data speaks to the need for robust clinical trials given the overall increase in opioid cessation for those that remained on cannabis. The study comes only weeks after separate longitudinal data from Canada reported that patients prescribed opioids reduced their opioid dosage by over 70% following the use of medical cannabis. The data to date is consistent and persuasive. For many pain patients, cannabis offers a viable alternative to opioids, potentially improving their quality of life while possessing a superior safety profile. This study, patients reported outcomes in those consuming medical cannabis, a prospective longitudinal observational study in chronic pain patients, appears in this month's edition of Canadian Journal of Anesthesia. That's the end of our HIP News segment for tonight. I want to remind you that if you are a loved one or looking to qualify or obtain a medical marijuana permit anywhere in the United States, we have a physician referral service at our office. Just call us at 503-235-4606. Again, if you're looking for a medical marijuana doctor to help obtain a state permit, we have a referral service all across the nation. Just call us at 503-235-4606. You can also tell your family and friends to watch this show on YouTube at youtube.com/cannabiscommonsense, or you can watch it on our Facebook page, which has about 650,000 followers, and that is facebook.com/restorehemp. And with that, we go to our interview with Ellen Kopp and help us restore hemp. Good night.
So I'd like to introduce Ellen Kopp to our show. Ellen, welcome to Cannabis Common Sense. It's great to have you on the show. We haven't met in person, but we have known each other and our work for years. I think I most memorably now here, 30 years later, remember you helped edit Jack Herer's book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes. And did you edit more than one edition?
No, I was an editor on the 9th edition, or the editor. I was traveling with Jack. I got involved at the end of 1991 doing hemp rallies at the federal building in LA, which we ended up doing quarterly 2-day rallies that really brought hemp to the masses. At the time when we couldn't even get the word hemp in the newspaper, they would always change it to marijuana. So we had to do it all very grassroots. And I worked at Jack's table at Venice Beach that did that. And then I traveled with him to Colorado in 1992, where we worked on a hemp initiative there, went to the Rainbow Gathering and then did that. And I remember this because it was during the election, the presidential election, and Al Gore was running for president, big environmentalist guy, right? And he was asked on the campaign trail about hemp and gave a very vague answer, which showed that he didn't really know what was going on. So Jack wanted to issue a press release in response to this interchange. And so I was sitting in a room with him and a bunch of people, and they were all throwing out ideas about what, should be said and everything. And I was taking notes. And so finally I stopped them all and said, okay, how about we say this? And I had been telling Jack, I can write, like I really, you're underutilizing me, I could really help with some of your press and things like that. And so when I read this press release I had put together about Al Gore, he grabs my hand and says, "You can write." I said, "Yeah, Jack, I've been telling you that." So anyway, so he figured that out. And so then when it came around to he wanted to do another edition of his book, he hired me to do that. We would go to this this place that had a bunch of computers that you could rent, and we would go in the middle of the night when the rent was cheaper and everything. And we would go and, bring his book up and work on it. And, every time he did an edition of that book, he weighed every word for its veracity and its currency and everything. And so we went through it all. And I also got to add, at the time had just come out information from Germany and France, because Matthias Brockers had just put out the book Hanf. And he had discovered one of the features of Jack's book is the USDA like 1937 pamphlet about growing hemp it wasn't 37, it was during World War II. And hemp had been basically made illegal in 1937 in the US, but then they brought it back during World War II because they needed it for the war effort. So the USDA put out these pamphlets encouraging farmers to grow hemp. Well, what we didn't know is Germany had the similar pamphlet at the same time in the same year to encourage their farmers to grow hemp for the war effort. And it was this very sort of, poetic pamphlet with these cute little illustrations of the male and the female hemp plant ready to, germinate and everything. And so I got to put that in, we included that pamphlet in that edition along with the translation. And then a second translation I included was this French company had come around to do this product called Isochambre, which was a mineralized version of hemp herds, and they were using it as building materials. And I speak a little bit of French, so I helped translate this from French into English. I remember very well there was this one word in the pamphlet called Mérovingienne, which I couldn't find in any French dictionaries, and I finally found it in an English dictionary. It means the Merovingian period, which was like the time of Christ. And so what it said in this pamphlet is there was a structure still standing that was built in the Merovingian period that used this hemp mineralization process to build it. Yeah, hempcrete. Basically, it was hempcrete. Yeah. That was all very exciting. Oh, and also the Schlichten papers had come out Right. Which were the big thing that Donnie Wirtschafter had discovered from the Ohio hempery, which I got to add those too. So that
Right.
was like, this
Explain to our
amazing,
audience what the Schlittigan papers are,
yeah,
because they were influential in hemp's banning, I believe.
right. So this is, because Jack never understood why the campaign against hemp started way earlier than, the Hearst campaigns and everything. And so this was 1917. This was a very heady time. This was America entering World War I, and there was a industrialist from Ohio, H. Timken, the inventor of the roller bearing, who was investing in a hemp cultivation project in the Imperial Valley in California. And a partner in this was E.W. Scripps of the Scripps Howard newspaper chain. They called him the penny press lord. And he had land in San Diego, Miramar, I think it was called. And he was part of this venture with Timken to grow, and they hired this guy, Milton McCrae, who was Timken's um, Timken's manager, to investigate this project. And he was waxing rhapsodic about it in all these letters. Oh, and I'm sorry, Schlichten, it was the inventor of this hemp brake, because hemp
To
is
mechanize hemp production, because it's very
yeah,
labor intensive up to that point.
right, and slaves had done it, and this is one reason that it fell by the wayside, because it was so labor intensive. But Schlichten had invented, an automatic hemp brake,
Yeah.
and they were trying this out in this experiment. And there were, these letters had interviews with Schlichten and everything. And so Milton McCrae went around the country to investigate the possibility of using this hemp brake. And at the time, they were saying, "Oh, there's going to be leftover hemp for twine and rope and all kinds of stuff, and we're going to be able to produce it at half the price of paper pulp and everything." And everyone was thinking this is just going to be such a great thing. But mysteriously, after McCrae traveled across the country and met with different paper suppliers, and also the Secretary of Interior, Franklin Lane, they just decided to abandon the project. For various reasons, I was able to uncover a letter of a sort of cabal, which you rarely see, where a bunch of San Diego businessmen got together and decided, with the war coming in, they would make more money just instead of diverting the water to the Imperial Valley to use to grow hemp. They would make more money just selling it to the war machine factories that were being built in San Diego at the time.
It's
And
amazing the contacts between the business center there in Southern California and San Diego in particular, and the Texas oil money. So there's a lot of cross travel between those two centers. And so I suspect that they also didn't want to see continued competition from hemp oil. I know Ford kept pushing that. Ford, built his vegetable oil, hemp oil, and linen, flax fiber automobile just 20 years after that. But it's interesting. I think
Rudolph Diesel was found drowned in the channel between France and England after he invented, the diesel engine, which would run on seed oil. So that I always thought was kind of strange. So there's a lot. Like I said, you rarely get these meetings of the cabals where they get together and they decide, well, this is all in our best interest, because those are rarely recorded. But I did find one recording that Milton McCrae made to send to E.W. Scripps of this meeting. And then Scripps wrote this letter to his sister, Ellen Browning Scripps, which I found at the Claremont College Library, saying, "Oh, I'll just put my faith in the great god Mammon, the god of greed, and I'm just going to raise the price of my newspapers to 2 cents." And this is the penny press lord. Another thing he was mad about was that this is when graduated income tax came in, and he was going to have to pay some serious income tax. And so he just decided, well, I don't need to make more money. I'm just not going to be able to keep it, and then Timken had to retool all his roller bearing factories for the war effort. And, there's always so many factors that go into these decisions. But DuPont also, there was thinking that DuPont was concerned about the nylon competition with nylon in the hemp rope. There was a DuPont paper factory in Florida and stuff. So, yeah, you could spend your whole life trying to unravel that hemp conspiracy. I'm happy to hear about people like you going forward with making hemp an industry, and it's very exciting right now with hemp being legal to grow finally in the U.S.
Yeah, yeah, it certainly is. There's a lot of developments, and that they're actually building factories to make hemp fabric and
Wow.
textiles. Texas of all places right now. So the Panda Biocorp, there, and it's just springing up all over the place. Thank goodness, because we need that to happen. There's
Yeah.
this irrational fear, though, of THC that limits farmers' ability to cultivate hemp, especially the banking
Yeah.
law. But just the levels of THC with 1/3 of 1% are lower mandated. Farmers can put all their money into a crop, and if it's 0.4 of 1%, then they have to destroy their crop, which is a
Yeah.
catastrophe for a small farmer. So that, I think, needs to change. We'll see. We'll see what happens with the
I
new.
know it's an arbitrary number that never made any sense. I never expected to be fighting that kind of thing. Of course, Jack's vision was, make it all legal at once and grow it all. And we've gone into these side issues. Like I ended up working in medical marijuana. I thought I just sidestep into that for a couple years because people kept coming up to my hemp information tables asking for medicine, like people in wheelchairs and people with cancer. And so I thought, like many of us in the greater reform movement, well, let's get it to the people who need it for medicine first. Well, that turned into at least a 20-year project, right? Because
It's
nitpicking
still
over what it
continuing.
looks. I mean,
It's
yeah, it's never ending. I mean, yeah, when I tell people I thought when we passed Prop 215, I was over with medical marijuana, they just laugh so hard because, once you regulate a commodity, and tax it and everything, there's just so many things that come into it. And even at the local level in California, we have 58 counties and 482 cities, each of them passing hemp regulations, about where it can be, or mostly banning
yeah, yeah.
businesses.
We've seen that in
Uh,
Oregon. We started a couple of years before you, and a couple of years after Colorado and Washington. But we had sponsored a bill in conjunction with the California and Washington initiative that would have legalized hemp and cannabis at the same time. But
uh,
that one, we just got 47% of the vote.
uh, so
But I
close.
barely financed that, but that's another story yet again. So initially, when you started working on this back in 91, that was right when hemp paper and hemp shirts and those things were out there. So you're doing these hemp booths with Jack. Did you do them
Yeah.
across the country or just in
No, I was local to California, pretty much mostly Southern California. Although then I started traveling around the state shortly after that. Except for Colorado, I did travel to Colorado with him that summer. But yeah, and then I've sort of recently spun off from a big part of Jack's book because Jack was always about the education. Because I remember he did a test in Oregon where they passed out an early version of the Emperor to certain precincts that were voting on their
I was involved
legalization.
in the
Yeah, and
1986 initiative campaign. So that was
yeah.
his very first and second
And so he
edition.
said, if people have this information, they're going to vote in our favor because that's what that experiment discovered. And so, and I've always been big on that too. And, getting the information out. And one part of Jack's book that really I always got great responses is the part where he talked about famous people who had used it, like Louis Armstrong and stuff. So I kind of took off from that with a website I developed in 2002 called veryimportantpotheads.com.
Oh, yeah.
I went back and really started reading, like biographies and stuff that talked about Louis Armstrong or Bing Crosby or whoever, like really trying to ferret out like unlikely suspects, who used it, because I found that was very convincing when you would tell someone, oh, well, did you know this person that you admire from the field of sports or whichever field, uses Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or something, and that would really open their eyes to, the prejudices that they had about what it did to people. So then of course I was especially fascinated if it turned out to be a woman who had a relationship with it. So then I spun that off into my Token Woman blog, and I have now produced this book, or really a booklet called Token Women. That's a kind of a distillation of my research about it, and I did it under my pen name Nola Evangelista, and it presents brief profiles of 50 women throughout, or females throughout history, who have been associated with cannabis, starting with ancient goddesses and up until today. And I'm still discovering new things all the time. And there was a Viking ship recently that was discovered with a couple of women on it that had cannabis. It's really been good helping to bring more women into the movement and into spokespeople for the movement, which I think has helped moved it forward. Again, just getting rid of some of the prejudices, and just women, mothers talking about the need for their children to have it for, CBD or THC. It's just been very powerful in a lot of state legislatures across the country and stuff. So it's been great to see more women involved. And I produced that book just before we had our legalization measure, Prop 64, on the ballot in 2016, because women have traditionally been voting for marijuana legalization 10% less often than men, but that is finally starting to change. I think the legalization is helping, and women are feeling more comfortable with it and more comfortable talking about it openly, and hopefully understanding it's part of our past too, not just men's.
Well, I'd like to remind our audience that I have Ellen Kopp here, who's a longtime cannabis activist for 30 plus years. And she's just out with a book. It's it's not just out, it's about 7 years ago, right? Or 6 or 7.
Yeah.
Token Women, the history of 4,000-year history of women and cannabis. I really like a number of points in it where, I think we mentioned before we started taping, I do these presentations and speaking engagements. And one of my favorite of the several that I do is the evolution of cannabis, the first 25,000 years. And I talk about a couple of these people in here, specifically the Egyptian goddess Heshet, and being the goddess of education and wisdom, and how she's often depicted with a cannabis leaf. And you were talking about some recent discoveries in Central Asia, around the Scythian tradition, which we learned about from Herodotus. And then in Jerusalem, they found the cannabis hot box, really, in an ancient temple there. So I find that fascinating, going back to the long association of humans with cannabis, and how it seems that cannabis is the foundation of agriculture and the civilizations that we know about. They're linked across the old world, Euro, Asia, and Africa.
The Scythians using it was the first report in the West through this Greek historian Herodotus, talked about how it was used in funeral rites. Well, what's been coming out lately, because they've been doing a lot of tests on these tombs all across the steppes of ancient warriors, and they often have cannabis seeds or cannabis burners and stuff. And now they're starting to do DNA testing on them and find out a lot of them were women. So the Scythian women were the Amazon women, the warriors, who, were riding horses and shooting arrows and doing all kinds of things that, women were doing in other parts of the world necessarily. And they were using cannabis. So yeah, the Amazon women, that's been a recent discovery. There was also a Viking ship discovered from about, I think, 1000 BC, or maybe even later, that had 2 women on it, an older woman and a younger woman, with a lot of the, these people were buried with all these accoutrements showing they were very high in society, shamans, priestesses and things. And they also had cannabis discovered in that, bag of cannabis seeds. So yeah, I think, Paul, you're right. this is what they would save is the cannabis seeds. Because yeah, we all know when you find a plant that does something like that for you, you want to save that seed. You want to grow it
More.
again. You
We
know?
want more, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm drawn to this, and I think many of us are. And you know, Timothy Leary actually said back in the '60s there are more cannabis smokers than there are Christians and Jews combined in this world.
Ooh,
And so you look at the ancient history, and it's fascinating. I first learned about it, and I first went to a cannabis protest a week after my 18th birthday in 1978. So I started
wow.
studying it a little bit before that. But when in 1981, a new book came out called by a fellow named Ernest Abel, and
Yes.
it was Marijuana, the First 12,000 Years. That opened my eyes to a lot of it. Then I saw Jack's first version, 2-page version of Jack's book in the Yippee newspaper Overthrow back in 1981. And
Wow.
so I was a contact in the Yippee newspaper Overthrow. They were one of the few groups working for marijuana legalization as well. But he was also talking about the very same thing and doing more research on it. So it opened our eyes to a lot of things. You know, back then, when Abel wrote that, they knew about 12,000 years, but now there's evidence showing that cannabis cultivation began at least 25,000 years ago there in Central Asia. And by
Right.
12,000 years ago, they found pollen and cultivation going on in present day Italy before the Romans, before the Etruscans. They were 12,000 years ago, they were cultivating cannabis there in Italy. So I think, as Carl Sagan talked about, that you know, it could be the very beginning of modern civilization as well.
Yeah, and Terence McKenna has some very interesting theories on that in Food of the Gods about the storytelling and the weaving and how it's all connected. And um, so, yeah, a great mind like Carl Sagan thinks that's possible. Of course, he was
Yeah,
an early um, uh, admitted pot smoker from a
yeah,
field where you didn't expect. Lester Grinspoon was a good friend of his, the doctor who wrote from Harvard, who wrote Marijuana Reconsidered in the 70s. And he outed him in a book originally as Mr. X, but then it came out later that it was Sagan. And that was very big. He was part of, again, Lester Grinspoon's project, and he has marijuanauses.com, I think is his URL. That was a big inspiration for me starting my project. He spoke at a normal conference about it, about kind of people outing, kind of in the gay movement. That was a big part of the gay movement is
yeah,
outing people without asking them, really, because so
right,
many people were in the closet and sometimes passing laws against being gay while they were gay and things like
right.
that. And
Yeah, Senator
so
comes.
yeah. The only way I out people without their permission is if they're busted for it, but that's been happening less and less. People are able to feeling more free to come out and speak about it. Like I said, also women like Melissa Etheridge, for example, or I mean, there's
Yeah,
so many that I've just added. Kamala Harris, our new vice president, admitted that she smoked it in college. She's my token woman of the year, even though when she was California AG, she wasn't really so great on this issue. But she's finally coming around, as so many have, recognizing what the racial injustice of the issue. I think Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, really brought that to the national debate. And now, people are able to embrace it for that reason. And so hopefully we can go further. In California, and I know in Oregon too, we still have to work on employment rights for cannabis
yeah,
users, even if you have a medical note in either of those states. And the states which passed laws later, like Arkansas, uh, medical marijuana laws, they learned from the lesson of California that you have to put it right in your law or else the courts aren't going to rule in your favor. And so there's now 16 states that are more progressive on this than California or Oregon. They have laws on the books that protect patients, at least, from discrimination in the workplace. And now the state of Maine, Nevada, New York City, Washington, D.C., and as of this week, Atlanta have laws protecting all recreational users, adult users of cannabis in the workplace. There are exceptions for safety sensitive positions. We're still working on educating people about, there's no test for cannabis intoxication like there is for alcohol, the breathalyzer test. And so all the employers say, well, there's no such test, and so we can't allow cannabis. We have to have zero tolerance for cannabis users in the workplace, even if they're using it off the job, even if it's not affecting their job performance, because there is no test we can use. But there are tests you can use. I mean, a blood test for one thing,
And
but
studies
also
that cannabis doesn't cause less absenteeism, or
right.
that cannabis users are more productive and better workers than non-cannabis users.
Right.
Those types of studies are suppressed.
Yeah, you don't see about them as often. I mean, you can find them on normal.org, who does great marijuana fact sheets on this, and opiates and all kinds of things. Yeah, and yeah, these are the industries that are concerned are like the construction industries, where there's very high opiate use, which is a bigger problem for both for the employer and for the employee. We're trying to push to a more uh, performance-based testing, like a sort of computer test you'd take the way they give like airline pilots or something, to measure your actual impairment or performance. But that's a big lift and a big change in the way we've been doing drug tests ever since the Reagan administration folks brought it in the 80s. They demanded urine testing from Department of Transportation, licensees. Anyone with a commercial driver's license has to be urine tested specifically. They're now
Just this morning, I had to testify in a custody case. I'm going to go back and give more testimony on Friday that dealt with urine testing and hair testing, and how it tests metabolites, not active impairment. It just shows how recently you've used cannabis, especially with urine testing, and with hair testing, how frequently you use it, more than how impaired you are. So in this one case, the parent was using tincture and topicals for pain and PTSD. A veteran with recurrent dreams. And one thing that most cannabis users know is, if you use cannabis, you won't remember your dreams as well. You pretty much don't remember hardly any of them.
Right, so helpful with PTSD oftentimes. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's one of the biggest benefits. But in this case, that was, the fact they're testing for metabolites rather than actual impairment just is misguided. As so much.
And a great book on all that and how that came to be is Abby Hoffman's book, Steal This Urine Test. He really details the whole thing about how they brought it in, yes, knowing that they were just testing metabolites, but that's what they had at the time. So
Right.
yeah, I hate to see a custody case around cannabis. We did get Prop 64 in California, a law that says you cannot take away someone's child just solely for their use of medical cannabis. And that has helped some. I have seen very few cases in California since that happened. We still find it in the case of growers, or, if there were other things going on. And very difficult because child custody cases are secret. They're not, you can't go into court and witness it. So we really don't know sometimes what's happening in some of these cases. So I'm glad you've been able to maybe bring some clarity to that case. I wish the best for the parent.
Yeah, I've done expert witness testimony in about a half dozen different states with our medical clinics primarily, but sometimes in regard to cultivation as well. But you're currently still involved with California NORML, and
Yep.
we'll talk about some of your current activities. And let's start off with some websites. I know you've got the very important Potheads one. Can name some other good websites our audience can go to learn more.
Well, my token woman is tokenwoman.blogspot.com. So TOKIN woman. And my book is Token Women. And then California NORML is CA Normal, NORML.org. That's my day job and mostly what I do. So we're,
Dale Garinger and you are partners in the California NORML. Are there other people involved in the organization?
Well, sure, we have a board, and there's lots of people, and there are several local chapters across California, people that we work with. But yeah, mostly Dale and I'm deputy director, he's director. He's been with them since the 80s,
Yeah,
So he's
yeah, I
just
remember Dale.
been our guiding light, and yeah, so and has enabled me really to keep working, because it's very difficult, as a lot of us know. In fact, I don't think there's an Oregon normal that's happening right now.
I don't think so as well. I think it's
Yeah, because and
not.
partly, and I talked to the people who had been involved up here, and I'm in Oregon at the moment, and people after legalization happened, and this happened somewhat in California too, the discussion all became about, who's making money in it, who isn't, all about like the regulations and everything. And it has been hard to keep some space around the human rights side, specifically. And our biggest push is for employment rights in California, which we still don't have. We passed a bill in 2008 to change the law after this bad court ruling came down and said that Prop 215 didn't protect people on the job. But Governor Schwarzenegger vetoed that law, and it took us 10 years to get it reintroduced. And now we've been held up by COVID, because, the only bills that are being heard are emergency bills around COVID and stuff. But we're still pushing forward. We're pushing forward on the people who objected to it last time, that need to be educated about it. We may try and go with a city by city approach. This is how we started with Prop 215. Like I said, the cities of Atlanta, DC, and New York all have laws on the books now. I don't know what it's going to take to get something to happen nationally. And of course, we've been very busy federally. Now, we're finally getting some federal movement. Not only a vote, but a yes vote on the MORE Act to deschedule cannabis and end
Yeah.
federal prohibition
Kamala,
happened in December.
Kamala Harris was a co-sponsor, the Senate sponsor of that during the last legislative session, which just ended a month ago. But it's like something's going to happen at the federal level now, especially since the Democrats won in Georgia, which was historic. Right. It gives them, if they ever come to a power sharing agreement in the Senate, I somehow wish Mitch McConnell would just go away, but
yeah.
So much.
So yeah, 50. So the Senate's now 50-50, and Harris could come in as the tiebreaker on a vote on that very bill, the one that she sponsored, to get it to pass the Senate finally. There is the little issue of the filibuster, and if you don't have 60 votes, you can still filibuster. There was a kerfuffle about that last week between McConnell and Schumer. I'm not sure how that's all gonna.
Hasn't ironed out yet as of today.
Yeah.
25th of January. We're filming this Monday, the 25th. So.
Yeah. So, and 50-50 is a narrow. I mean, that's as divided as you can get in the country. And we'll certainly continue to have a divided country, but we are seeing more and more bipartisan support for this. We think at least we'll get some kind of banking bill through, because that has a lot of support from the American Banking Association and places like that.
Any hemp farmer will need a bank account. I personally have had my bank accounts closed 20 times since 2007.
Wow.
And out of those 20 different bank closures, 18 times they would not tell me why my bank account was being closed. They just said, "Oh, we don't have to tell you, because when you sign your account agreement, when you open the account, they say they can close your account for no reason at all." And so
it's a huge problem. And after the recent rebellions around George Floyd and stuff, there were major robberies of a lot of cannabis businesses in California. Because people who knew that the police were going to be otherwise occupied, and they came in with like a bevy of SUVs and came in and stole the cash and the product. And so it's really made the businesses very vulnerable to that sort of thing. In fact, some businesses weren't able to even reopen, or had to completely reorganize or something in order to try to open. So we're still having a lot of access problems around California. There are these cannabis deserts around because of all these 58 counties and 482 cities. A lot of them are banning. I mean, at least, like maybe 20% of California is open up right now to cannabis businesses. It's changing, and when alcohol prohibition ended, there were wet counties and dry counties all across the nation, and there are very few of those left anymore. So it's a process, but it's difficult because a lot of NIMBYism, a lot of even local corruption going on, and um, the opposition is well organized. We just found out like the anti-tobacco people are using anti-tobacco funds to show up at meetings and argue against people being able to consume cannabis, either in consumption rooms or in their own homes and in rental properties. And so, there's no, I always say repression never takes a holiday, there's no end to our opposition. People are showing up at meetings just spouting reefer madness stuff. It's still, we still got work to do to educate, and especially at the local level where the rubber's really hitting the road in a lot of states, I think California included.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think if they change the federal laws, then that'll open up changes at the state and local level on a lot greater basis, because a lot of times our opposition still uses that argument. It's about federal law.
It's true, and they're scared, and they're worried about federal funding. For example, we had a bill that was vetoed by Governor Newsom last year that would have allowed people to use it in end-of-life situations in hospitals. But the Hospital Association lobbied against it because they were afraid of losing federal funding. This also impacts things like federal housing and veterans. The VA, you can't get a medical recommendation at the VA, much less are they going to, pay for you to use it. So a lot of veterans have been really seriously impacted by these laws that have now upped the price of cannabis. They've made it difficult for veterans to have access to it because it's more difficult to get a license now to sell it here in California than it used to be. And so these are the last groups that we really should be, taking access away from. They need it for pain, they need it for PTSD. They're being given much more dangerous drugs to use instead. And the veterans have been very active actually in California, turning a lot of Republican lawmakers over to vote in favor of, there was a bill that we had to actually pass a bill to allow people to give away cannabis because it wasn't codified in the current bill. And so you still have to pay taxes on the cannabis that you gave away. So people weren't able to do that anymore. So we had to pass a bill to change that. And these vets were able to get some Republicans on their side because a lot of them are veterans or they have families who are vets and things. So we're seeing a lot of the crumbling of the facade in so many ways. But of course, it's like the ant biting the elephant's hide, There's got to be a lot of us, and we've got to just keep at them.
I hear that elephants are really afraid of bees, so they have a phobia of bees. We have this belief, and I'm not sure how true it is, that they're afraid of mice, right? But
yeah,
it turns out they're
so
really
a little guy can have effect, especially working together. Yeah,
indeed.
I don't mean I'm not using the elephant because that's the Republican symbol. It's, like I said, more and more Republicans are coming around to our side. NORML's a nonpartisan organization. It has mostly been Democrats on our side, but, we're still, Biden, as we know, has been a drug warrior in the past, as was everyone in politics in those days. But he's only gone so far as for rescheduling, maybe treatment. He's big on that. So,
but
he's not.
He and the senator in Massachusetts said 6 months ago that the Congress is going to push Biden when he's elected, that he'll sign the laws. That's what Markey speculated anyway. But maybe Kamala will too.
Yeah, and Kamala, like I said, has really come around. And yeah, if it's her bill, I think he's going to have a hard time not signing it. There were some last minute compromises in the MORE Act, though, before it passed the House, continuing to allow the DOT to drug test, which I hated, and also barring people with past convictions from opening cannabis businesses, which is something California's law was very progressive about, allows people to do that. I mean, that's I haven't worked for 30 years for legalization for, a few rich venture capitalist guys to come in and take over the business, and then everybody else is still illegal and being put in jail or being put out of business. So that's not justice. So we have to continue to fight. And uh, Normal has gotten behind equity provisions and laws in a lot of places, and that's a big lift, because what's really keeping equity from happening is finances. Uh, so we're having companies come in, partner with some equity players and stuff, and that's good if it's done properly, but if it's a takeover, then it's not. So there's just a lot that needs to be watchdogged, including now California has a law for automatic expungement of past marijuana crimes, but that's something that needs to be watchdogged because the courts don't have a deadline to do that, and most of them haven't come forward and done it. But that's become a national conversation now, where the MORE Act actually also has expungement. A lot of the states that are coming on, Illinois is just doing expungement. Is Oregon doing it?
Yeah, yeah, it's they recently allowed it for simple possession without any fee. If it's more than simple possession, then you have to jump through a few more hoops. The person has to get their fingerprints and send them into the state police and get approval of the prosecutor and the judge. Generally, it's a little process, but it's not too involved. But yeah, it can be expunged here in Oregon as well. Thank goodness. But I think your idea, you were talking about working city by city in Los Angeles. I think most Americans don't realize that Los Angeles County alone is bigger than 39 US states in terms of population. 39 states don't have as many people as the 12 million people in Los Angeles County alone. You've got 40 million across the state. So obviously
it's very hard to bring in. They tried to bring in an equity program kind of late, and then they got sued, and there's just it's a big, and it's all one big shopping mall. Like you drive around LA, there's just so much retail space and everything. So a licensed collective would open and follow all the rules as far as the hours they could be open and pay all their taxes, and then I'd go to see it, and then like within eye shot of it, I'd see 3 unlicensed ones. So it's a big
we don't have that problem in Oregon. We
really?
don't have shops. Yeah. Fortunately, the people who've gone to getting the license don't compete with much of that. I mean, the black market's still there, but more and more of it is transferring to the green market, the legal market.
Or going out of state, I would assume, because that's true in California too.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, that's always a problem, and
Well, if
that's
we do get federal legalization and
the
people are able
price
to export
differentiation.
to other states, that could be very big for Oregon and California farmers, I think.
Yeah,
Because we have the climate, we can grow it outdoors. That's a big advantage over places that have to pay the extra and just lose the sunshine and the fresh air and everything that
yeah.
you usually use to grow things.
Here in
Um,
Oregon, the legislature has already passed the law that will allow cannabis to be shipped interstate when the federal government will allow it. And so,
yeah.
obviously, Oregon, Northern California, and with the appellation of names to regions, kind of like Champagne coming from Champagne, France.
There's a law that passed last year in California allowing for appellations. Is that happening in Oregon too?
Yes, yeah. I mean, not by law yet in terms of that,
Mhm.
but the law has changed to allow for shipping to other jurisdictions once the federal government doesn't prohibit it, which hopefully will be this year. But it's
Yeah.
amazing, though, with our history going back these 30 plus years to see how much things have changed. I was going through the year end review of 2020 where, it was a bad year in a lot of different ways. There's no doubt about that. But back 30 years ago, the only stories there were about cannabis were bust stories. Very rarely would we break through and get stories about hemp or cannabis medicine.
Yeah, I was just telling I've been hanging out with Elvie Musica, who I know you've interviewed several times on the show, and I was just telling her how we'd have those hemp rallies, and we would try to get them to the press talk about hemp, and they would just come. They'd hand us their cards, and they'd say, "Call us if someone's busted."
Yeah. Yeah.
That's all they wanted to report on, or they wanted to show a picture of someone
They want
smoking.
you to smoke pot for them. That's what they would always say to us back in the 80s and 90s. Come smoke some marijuana for us. So back when CNN,
That's all they wanted from her. Yeah.
right, back when I was interviewed on CNN back in 2009, I showed them volcano vaporization, and it still was kind of risque showing them the vaporization. So
Yeah, Cal Normal actually did the first studies on that volcano vaporizer and has been advancing vaping as a healthy alternative for some time. The vaping crisis really kind of set us back on that, even though those were unlicensed products that was causing the serious illnesses and
yeah, it
sometimes
wasn't cannabis. It was something they put into their
yeah,
club.
but
That's
that's
the
really kind of muddled the whole issue and brought in a lot of these anti-tobacco forces that I've mentioned that are kind of lumping everything in, cannabis smoking with tobacco and then vaping with all of it. So yeah, that's been a constant education challenge to separate, because there's very few places now in California you can go and smoke it. You can't smoke it in public by law. A lot of landlords won't allow it to be smoked, and some of these cities are now passing laws against it because the landlords don't even want to enforce that. They want the city enforcing that. And there's very few consumption rooms. There are a few in California and stuff, and of course during COVID isn't the time to really be fighting for that. But when Prop 215 first passed, you could go to all these dispensaries, these medical marijuana dispensaries, and hang out with people and smoke it. And that's more, what our community is about, getting together and
Yeah,
using it.
that's
And
one of the things that attracted me was the social aspect of cannabis use as a teenager, to be honest. But
yeah. And
back
I
in
say,
the
what if liquor could only be sold in liquor stores that can't sell anything else? And there's no bars or restaurants where you can go and enjoy it with anybody else. I mean, that just wouldn't be. So, and again, it's an education around, safe consumption. I am concerned about people taking edibles and then going out and getting in their car and driving, because that hits you an hour later.
yeah, yeah. And
So people are
not
doing
used to
maybe some low dose edibles, or, with education around it and stuff. But yeah, so the better thing to do when you get together is to smoke it, because then it hits you right away. You know how stoned you are or aren't, and then it wears off in time for you to drive home.
yeah.
So
Well,
smoking or vaping. Yeah.
we're probably about done with our time here. So once again, I want to promote your book, Token Women, and we'll put that website up there that you mentioned. And I really want to thank you for your continued work with California Normal. And I look forward to having you back on to talk about these issues. You were very well informed on them, and I appreciate that. Thanks for all you've done. It's
Well,
great to virtually meet you.
yeah,
And thanks for helping out our friend Elvie Masika.
yeah, she's a treasure.
She is.
So,
She is.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Well,
Great.
thank you again, Miss Ellen Comp. And remember, restore hemp. Good night.